we got a new play on the China American chess game going on. And China has now made a deal with Cuba where they will be operating in some joint military training facilities in Cuba.
Hmm.
Really crazy escalation. China coming into this hemisphere in a military capacity like that. There were talks about this happening back in 2019, but it wasn't set in stone. And now it looks like it's going to be getting off the ground, and this is going to be something America has to deal with.
Yeah. Um, I think this makes a lot of sense from China's perspective and just from the perspective of the conflict in general. Like in the context of this, um, we have a massive presence in the Pacific. The most military bases we have in any country that isn't the United States is Japan.
Yeah.
We are stationed in Guam. We just signed a deal to put more military bases in the Philippines. This is one of those things where, like, I don't blame China. I don't think I can eat, like, I don't think I can be like they're doing something wrong for this.
Yeah.
This is just a prudent um, national security move that they're making.
Right. I mean, if I was China, I would do the same thing. If I was China and America is starting to send more aid to Taiwan, building up more bases on the Philippines, as you said, has the most amount of military bases in Japan outside of the United States. Like, yeah, I'm going to put a military base on your border, dude. I'm going to have military operations right across your waters, the same way you do to me, you know,
Exactly.
tit for tat. So I don't really blame China for this. Obviously, we have to see how America responds because America has a history of not accepting the tit for tat, and saying, and, you know, being like, okay, the second you play the game that we're playing, we're going to flip the board over.
Yeah.
That's kind of what the Cuban Missile Crisis was. I mean, in 1963, we had missiles in Turkey and Greece that were capable of attacking the Soviet Union's homeland. And the
Hmm.
Soviet Union didn't really have missiles that were capable of hitting the capital or significant urban areas in the United States. So that's why they put missiles in Cuba, to have the
Right.
same, you know, mutually assured destruction capacity as the United States did because of their Turkish and Greek stationed missiles. And,
Hmm.
you know, world almost ended for that. So with this, I don't see, like, obviously it's not that big of an escalation. I don't think joint military training is the same thing as offensive capable nuclear missiles, right?
Hmm.
Um, but I don't know how America is going to handle this. I mean, obviously, it makes sense because America is starting to send advisors to Taiwan and train Taiwanese defenders. So it makes sense that China would want to do the same.
Yeah.
You know, the difference
Definitely.
is China wants to invade Taiwan, and we have no interest in invading Cuba, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's the difference.
Yeah. If anything, yeah, the difference is they want to be here so they can be like, hey, we can poke you with a sharp stick if you decide to come over and help Taiwan out. Like we're
Right.
right here and we can do stuff. Um, I also don't know what America's response is though. They don't have jurisdiction over anything in Cuba. They're not an ally of Cuba. We can't, like, it doesn't seem like we can really stretch our influence here. We've already stretched our influence so far. Like we have placed so much of our weight in the Pacific as far as our
Mm-hmm.
naval operations and all these military bases. I don't know. Like I guess we could sanction them, but
We
I
already
don't think we
sanctioned
see
the
them.
hell out of Cuba. I mean, there's a Cuba, like the amount of sanctions we have on Cuba right now are, I mean, they're all of them. Every sanction you can imagine is placed on Cuba already. And
Yeah.
I think that's kind of the problem. I think a lot of the problems and the reason that this is happening, and honestly, I think the reason that Cuba has been a thorn in America's ass for so long is because we refuse to work with the Cuban government in a way that can facilitate a cooperative mentality between the two countries. If,
Mm,
you know, if you don't want China to fall into our enemy's sphere, put them in your sphere. You know, if you don't want them going to China for military cooperation, say, okay, well, we'll start sending you pharmaceuticals. We'll start sending you, you know, consumer goods. We'll get you involved in the American economy. We'll get free trade between our two nations. We'll, you know, start this thing up.
hmm.
We'll become, you know, we'll get our tourists going again. We can send people to Cuba and you can have a whole tourist industry based off American citizens. Like, this is something that would encourage Cubans and Americans to get over this 60-year battle that we've been going through with them. But the United States is just so reluctant to do that. And because of that, of course, they're going to go find the other geopolitical hegemon on the other side of the world. What's their other option?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's as simple as that. I don't really have much else here.
The only thing I'll add too is there is an obvious political struggle about taking the sanctions off Cuba because there is a large. This is how I think about this. The reason the sanctions on Cuba haven't been lifted is because the Cuban population is a sizable voting bloc in Florida, and both parties in the United States, the Democrats and Republicans, both try to win Florida every election. And if you come out and be, okay, let's do free trade with Cuba, all the Cubans in Florida now say, oh my God, you support the socialist regime in Cuba, we hate you. And then you'll never be able to win an election in Florida. But now I think that there's the new development is like, okay, I think Florida's a red state. Like, Democrats should be able to move on from this. Say, all right, Republicans, you got Florida. We're going to go for Texas next. Just take it and we'll do the sanctions and we'll never win the Cuban votes again.
I agree with that. Like the data right now is that is that Cuban Americans vote so majority Republican. It almost, to me, like, I feel like Democrats should be looking at Cuban Americans the same way Republicans look at black voters, and which is like also kind of a scary and sad thing to say, because it means once you're like, they kind of feel like they've pocketed these ethnicities, just like, oh, we've got them, we don't have to worry about them in our campaigning. But I don't know. I mean, from an ideological perspective, I also just think about this as, I would rather politicians make stands that align with their values. I mean, this is the obvious thing to say, rather than fishing for voters. But I live in fantasy land.
That's a whole other thing. But I mean, that's what's going on with China and Cuba, and it's going to be a hell of a. I'm just interested to see what America's response is going to be. Maybe it'll be nothing, until it gets more like offensive capable weaponry going into Cuba from China. I think that's when it gets dicey. Right now, just military training doesn't have that same offensive capability that I think would really scare the United States. So until that develops, I don't think there's going to be much action, but we'll see. Just another move on the chessboard.